Story 1. Salt, Soap, and Sea Spray. Washing clothes on 18th century ships. Imagine yourself on an 18th century sailing vessel, somewhere between the coastlines of Europe and the far reaches of the Caribbean. The smell of tar, rope, brine, and human sweat lingers in every plank of the ship. There are men everywhere, pressed together in hammocks or crouched on deck. And yet, amidst all this bustle, there is one constant reality: clothes grow filthy. Sailors labored in wool, canvas, and linen, fabrics chosen for durability rather than comfort. These fabrics held sweat and salt, and with weeks or months at sea, the grime grew into a kind of second skin. The washing of clothes was not simply a matter of appearance, it was a necessity for health, morale, and survival. Yet the process was far from simple. A ship had no laundry room, no clean tubs of hot water, and certainly no laundry soap in the modern sense. Instead, men made do with what they had: salt water, coarse soap, when available, buckets, and the ceaseless motion of the sea itself. Soap at sea, a rare commodity. Soap was neither cheap nor plentiful aboard ships. Ordinary crew often had to provide their own if they wanted it, and most did not bother. Naval vessels might issue small rations of lye-based soap, but merchant sailors rarely saw such luxury. Instead, the men relied on seawater itself as a cleanser, scrubbing cloth against cloth, or stone against plank, to scrape away the buildup of dirt. Salt acted as a natural abrasive, though it left the fabric stiff and scratchy, especially when the sun baked it dry on the rigging. This stiffness was not a minor discomfort. A sailor's shirt, hardened with salt, rubbed against skin already raw from rope burns or sunburn. Still, it was preferable to letting vermin nest in the folds of dirty fabric. Methods of washing. On calmer days, when the sea did not rage, sailors would take the chance to haul buckets of water from the side. They soaked their shirts, breeches, and underclothes, then beat them against the deck or against barrels. Some tied garments with rope and let them drag in the ship's wake, the endless churn of seawater acting as a natural washboard. The danger, of course, was losing a garment to the deep. Many sailors owned only one or two changes of clothes, and to lose a shirt meant days, weeks, or months of discomfort. Once washed, drying was another challenge. Clothes were spread across ropes, sails, or the ship's rails. But the sea was not a laundry line, it was unpredictable. A sudden squall might soak everything again, and in tropical climates, the humidity meant garments often never fully dried, leaving them sour-smelling and prone to mildew. Social aspects of laundry. Laundry was not merely a chore. It was also one of the few moments of relative calm in a sailor's routine. Men would joke, argue, or sing as they scrubbed together. Dirty laundry was a universal equalizer. Officers might keep their hands clean, but they too had to find someone to wash their uniforms. Some ships allowed sailors' wives or camp followers aboard during longer voyages. These women often took on washing duties for a small fee or share of provisions. On naval ships, however, the work usually fell to the men themselves. Hygiene, disease, and vermin. Behind this routine lay a serious concern: health. Dirty clothes harbored lice, fleas, and disease. It was not uncommon for a sailor to shake out his shirt and see vermin drop onto the deck. Washing, imperfect as it was, offered at least some relief. Shipboard surgeons, though limited in medical knowledge, understood enough to insist on occasional laundering. A shirt washed in salt water might be uncomfortable, but it was less likely to crawl with lice. Still, the balance was never easy. Too much salt stiffened cloth to the point of discomfort, while too little washing meant outbreaks of itch, sores, or worse. The choice was not between clean and dirty, but between degrees of discomfort. The symbol of cleanliness. It is easy now to think of laundry as routine, but for sailors it carried deeper meaning. A shirt freshly rinsed, even if stiff, was a sign of order in an otherwise chaotic world. Ships pitched and rolled, storms threatened, food spoiled, but a sailor could cling to one small victory: the chance to wear something cleaner than yesterday. It was a fragile comfort, but one that mattered. A question left hanging: And yet, one wonders how effective could these methods truly be? With seawater alone, without proper soap, without boiling, without thorough rinsing, did these sailors ever really feel clean? Or was the act of washing more symbolic than practical, a ritual of order against the endless dirt of the sea? Laundry aboard 18th century sailing ships was more than an act of cleaning, it was an act of improvisation. Resources were scarce, water was rationed, soap was expensive, space was limited, and yet the human need to clean persisted. The freshwater supply on ships was primarily reserved for drinking and cooking. Even on well-provisioned voyages, a sailor might receive only a quart or two of water a day. That didn't leave much room for washing clothes or bodies. Seawater then became the standard alternative, but it came with its drawbacks. Salt encrusted everything it touched. Garments faded, stiffened, and frayed more quickly. Buttons rusted. Thread broke. Wool shrank and itched. Linen held the smell of sea rot. But still, sailors tried. They scrubbed with whatever they could find: sand, brushes, even bits of rope. The act of cleaning clothing became a physical negotiation between the elements and the tools at hand. A day reserved for washing. Though there was no official laundry day, some ships implemented structured routines. On certain naval vessels, Sundays were observed as a day of relative rest, and some captains allowed laundry to be done then. Others discouraged it altogether, preferring a tidy deck over flapping linens. But rules varied by ship, captain, and region. A vessel sailing out of Portsmouth might have a different culture from one hailing from Amsterdam or Boston. Some officers allowed the men to wash clothes during caulking days, when repairs were being done and routine tasks paused. In the Caribbean or South Pacific, ships would anchor near freshwater sources or friendly ports, offering rare opportunities for thorough washing on shore. Those were prized days. Sailors would line the shore with garments, filling buckets from streams, scrubbing on rocks, boiling shirts in iron kettles if available. The scent of boiling lye and wood smoke filled the tropical air. The men could bathe, scrape off weeks of grime, and shave. Some even stitched tears or replaced buttons lost to storms or salt. And yet these occasions were rare. For every day spent scrubbing clothes by a tropical spring, there were dozens spent struggling with buckets on a rolling deck, salt spray stinging their eyes, knuckles raw from rope and rock. The clothes themselves. To understand the difficulty of washing at sea, it helps to know what sailors wore. Most common sailors owned very little. A typical wardrobe included a shirt or two, made of linen or cotton. Breeches, often wool or heavy canvas. Woolen socks, prone to staying damp. A waistcoat, practical but hard to wash. A woolen or tarred canvas jacket, sometimes waterproofed with oil. A hat or cap, offering little defense against rain. Drawers, though many went without. These clothes were not washed daily. Some items might go weeks or months before they were cleaned. The challenge wasn't just the dirt but the very materials. Wool was difficult to dry fully. Canvas took days. Even linen could mildew in humid climates. In addition, many sailors went barefoot to preserve their shoes. Their feet cracked, grew thick-skinned, and attracted infections. Clean socks helped, but only if they were clean and dry. In this environment, washing was survival. Stitching and mending, the forgotten half of laundry. Washing damaged clothing. Threads frayed, seams tore, buttons vanished in the ocean spray. So laundry was often paired with mending. Sailors kept needles and bits of thread in small bags or tobacco tins. In the downtime between chores, some sat cross-legged on deck, darning socks or patching breeches. Mending was a respected, even admired, skill. Those who could repair clothes efficiently were in demand. Some made extra money patching garments, for others exchanging mending for food, tobacco, or favors. This unspoken economy thrived quietly on every ship. Sometimes, a ship's purser might issue scraps of canvas or linen for mending, especially if the voyage was long. Other times, sailors bartered their own items, cutting up an old shirt to patch a breach, or using sail thread to sew a jacket. And because the sea corroded everything metal, wood, even cloth, this cycle of wearing, washing, tearing, and mending became endless. Punishments and inspections. Surprisingly, cleanliness was occasionally a matter of discipline. On naval vessels, especially in the British Royal Navy, ship captains inspected the crew's appearance. A man who refused to wash could be reprimanded or worse. Clean clothes, or the appearance of them, were seen as a mark of respect for the ship and her command. Some captains viewed excessive slovenliness as a threat to morale. A man who didn't wash his shirt might be seen as giving up, as slipping into apathy, and apathy was dangerous aboard a vessel where discipline kept everything afloat. To counter this, some commanding officers enforced routine inspections: shaved faces, clean shirts, tidied hammocks. While no sailor was expected to be spotless, visible neglect could draw a lashing or loss of rations. In contrast, merchant vessels were more lax. The priorities were speed, profit, and avoiding mutiny, not personal hygiene. Many merchant sailors stank freely and didn't care. Still, even among the roughest crews, peer pressure could prompt the occasional rinse or patch job. Laundry tools and innovations. The tools of shipboard laundry were few, but some ships carried additional items. Wooden washboards, rough surfaces for scrubbing though rare at sea. Scrub brushes, bristled tools for beating fabric. Tallow or soap substitutes, animal fat, ashes, or even clay used for cleaning. Metal hoops or barrels, occasionally used as makeshift tubs. Lines for drying, ropes strung from mast to mast or rail to rail. Some innovative sailors even fashioned rudimentary washing machines: a barrel fixed with a paddle, rotated manually with rope. Clothes were tossed inside with seawater, then spun by hand. The effect was similar to dragging garments in the ship's wake, but with more control. These inventions, however, were rare and often short-lived. Most sailors simply relied on time and friction, and a bit of luck. Ritual and repetition. Laundry became part of the ship's rhythm. Like bells marking the watch or the call for grog, the sight of shirts flapping in the wind was a familiar, even comforting, image. It reminded the crew that despite the hardship, some things could still be controlled. In a world of unpredictable weather, delayed landfall, and uncertain health, the act of washing one's shirt, even poorly, was a declaration of dignity. But what did clean even mean to men who had never known modern standards of hygiene? Was it simply the absence of visible grime, or something deeper, something tied to identity, self-respect, and survival? By the 1700s, life at sea had taken on a rhythm of monotony punctuated by bursts of terror, storms, battle, disease. But in the in-between spaces, the mundane details took on a quiet, almost sacred significance. A shirt was not just a garment. It was your skin, your blanket, your towel. It was your armor against the wind, your only layer of dignity when standing before an officer. And so the act of laundering, humble though it seemed, was deeply tied to a sailor's sense of personhood. When a man took off his shirt to scrub it in a bucket of salt water, what was he doing, really? Was he cleaning away sweat and filth? Or was he renewing his sense of self, reasserting, if only briefly, control over a world that constantly stripped control away? In a life where privacy was nearly non-existent, laundry was one of the rare semi-private acts. A man crouched near the railing, sleeves rolled, hands red from the brine, quietly tending to something that was entirely his. His shirt, his labor, his body. Memories in the fabric. Old sea garments told stories, not just of stains and salt, but of where they had been. A patch from a torn sail stitched onto a breech, a button carved from a whale's tooth, a pocket repaired 3 times over. Some men personalized their garments with embroidery, initials, dates, simple markings that meant something only to them. Garments aged visibly. Linen yellowed, canvas softened and then split. Wool became thinner with each rinse in salt water. Clothes were rarely thrown away until they were beyond repair. A ragged shirt might become a sail patch or a cleaning cloth. Even when reduced to scraps, fabric found a second or third life. For many, these clothes were also the last they'd wear. If a sailor died at sea, whether from fever, injury, or accident, his possessions were typically auctioned off among the crew. His cleanest garments might pass to another man, continuing their life across new voyages. And so the story of laundry was never just about soap and seawater. It was about continuity, reuse, and remembrance. The female laundry hands of shore. When ships reached port, a very different kind of laundry began. In coastal towns, particularly in port cities like Portsmouth, Boston, Cadiz, or Kingston, there existed a quiet economy around sailors' clothes. Women, often widows or wives of sailors themselves, took in laundry for a price. This was no less laborious than washing at sea, only more effective. Clothes could be boiled, scrubbed with lye or ash, pounded on rocks, and dried in the sun. Mending could be done with proper tools, and garments returned with seams tight and sleeves restitched. In many cases, sailors preferred to wait for port to wash their most treasured items. They would hold on to a favorite shirt or breeches until they could pay a skilled hand to restore it. This created a ritual of return laundry as a homecoming. Some naval ports even employed full-time laundresses for officers' uniforms. These women, though poorly paid, were vital to maintaining the crisp appearance demanded by naval decorum. Thus, the gendered division of labor returned ashore. While men at sea learned to wash with rope and salt, they still passed off the final rinse when possible to women who made it their trade. Naval regulations and cleanliness. By the late 18th century, some naval authorities began to recognize the importance of hygiene, albeit through the lens of efficiency and control. The British Royal Navy, in particular, began issuing periodic instructions related to laundry and clothing. "Cleanliness is next to godliness" became a mantra among some officers, especially those of evangelical leanings. Medical officers noted the connection between filth and disease, though germ theory was still decades away. Crews were sometimes ordered to wash hammocks and bedding in addition to clothing, particularly during outbreaks of fever or lice. Though not all captains enforced these rules with equal rigor, the idea of cleanliness as discipline had begun to take hold. The image of the tidy sailor, though often exaggerated, became a symbol of naval strength. Yet for the common sailor, the reality remained the same. A bucket of seawater, a bit of soap if lucky, and the ever-present rhythm of scrub, rinse, and hang. The psychological anchor. At its heart, the act of washing clothes at sea was a psychological ritual, a way to mark time, a way to cleanse not just the body, but the fatigue, fear, and claustrophobia of ocean life. Clothing was one of the few private possessions a man owned on board. When he laundered it, he reaffirmed something essential. It wasn't about being clean in the modern sense. It was about dignity, about not letting the ship consume your humanity. There are accounts, though sparse, of sailors saving a clean shirt for landfall, or for a visit from the captain, or even to wear when writing a letter home. This act, small though it may seem, was monumental. It meant hope. A shirt saved was a future imagined. The enduring legacy. Laundry at sea in the 18th century might seem trivial, but it reflected deeper themes of adaptation, self-reliance, and endurance. These were men who faced scurvy, battle, shipwreck, and exile, and yet they still bent over a bucket, knuckles deep in salt water, scrubbing their only shirt clean. In that small act, there is something universal, the struggle to maintain a semblance of self in conditions that would strip it away. Today, in maritime museums or recreated ships, visitors rarely ask about the laundry. They admire the sails, the cannons, the maps, but the stories embedded in every seam, every patch, every scratchy woolen sock, that's where the real, boring human history lies. Final reflection. So when we ask how sailors washed clothes on 18th-century ships, we uncover more than method, we uncover motive. The urge to feel clean, if only briefly. The desire to own something even if it's only the salt-stiff shirt on your back. And perhaps that's the most enduring truth. In the vast loneliness of the sea, a clean shirt wasn't just cloth, it was civilization. Story 2. The long wait for bread, how medieval peasants baked once a week. Imagine living in a world where bread, your primary source of sustenance, is baked only once a week. No soft loaves from the corner bakery. No warm slices in the morning. Just one batch of bread, made to last, coarse and dry by the end of the week. This was the reality for most medieval peasants across Europe. To understand how medieval people baked, and more importantly, why they baked so infrequently, we need to peel back the layers of rural life between the 9th and 14th centuries. These were times of deeply rooted rhythms, dictated by the seasons, the land, and the lord of the manor. Most peasants lived in manorial villages, governed by local lords and their stewards. Daily life revolved around agriculture, survival, and religious observance. Food, in its simplest forms, was often the central concern, and bread was the foundation. But unlike today's industrialized food systems, baking was a resource-intensive endeavor that consumed time, labor, fuel, and communal cooperation. Grain, the foundation of everything. Before any baking could be done, there was grain, and growing it was a monumental task. Most medieval peasants worked strips of land in the open field system, planting rye, barley, or wheat when they could afford it, and harvesting once a year. The grain was cut with sickles, tied into sheaves, threshed with flails to separate the kernels, and then winnowed to remove chaff. Each of these stages required communal effort, coordinated labor, and reliance on fickle weather. Wheat, prized for making the whitest, finest bread, was expensive and rare among the poor. Rye and barley were more common in northern Europe. In some areas, peasants relied on oats, millet, or spelt. But whatever the grain, the next step was the same: grinding. The lord's mill, grinding taxes and control. Peasants were often required by law and custom to use the local lord's mill. This wasn't just a matter of convenience. It was a form of control. Lords owned the mills and charged their tenants to use them, taking a portion of the flour as payment, often 1/16 or more. Attempting to grind grain by hand or in a private mill was considered illegal and could lead to punishment. So peasants carried their sacks of grain, sometimes for miles, to the manorial mill. There, the miller ground the grain between great millstones, powered by wind or water, depending on the region. The process could take hours or even days during busy periods like harvest season. The flour that returned home was often coarse, full of bran, and mixed with other grains or even legumes to stretch it further. It lacked the smooth consistency we associate with modern white flour. Still, for most people, this was the base of their diet. Flour in hand, the next obstacle loomed: baking. Ovens, few and far between. Most medieval peasants did not own ovens. Building one was a costly and space-consuming endeavor. An oven required clay, bricks, or stone, fuel, and know-how. Maintaining it required time and wood, both of which were often scarce or tightly controlled. Instead, many villages had communal ovens, often owned by the local lord or monastery. Like the mill, these ovens could not be used freely. Peasants paid a baking fee, known in some regions as banalités. This gave rise to the term banal oven, a regulated communal oven under feudal obligation. Once or twice a week, usually on Sundays or specific baking days, families would bring their prepared loaves to the oven keeper, who managed the fire and loaded the bread. The oven was preheated by burning wood inside the chamber. Once the interior reached high heat, the coals were swept out, and the bread was placed on the hot stone floor to bake in retained heat. The loaves were marked with special notches or symbols to identify whose was whose. These marks were often made with slashes, sticks, or carved wooden stamps. Even this identification became part of village culture. The dough itself, sour, coarse, and heavy. Medieval bread wasn't the fluffy, yeasty product we know today. Commercial yeast did not exist. Instead, bakers relied on natural fermentation sourdough starters cultivated by mixing flour and water and letting wild yeasts develop. This process could take days and required skill to maintain. The resulting dough was thick, heavy, and slow to rise. In colder months, it might barely rise at all. Most loaves were dense and dark, with rough textures. White bread pain blanc in France or wastel bread in England was reserved for the rich and for religious ceremonies. A common peasant loaf, especially in northern Europe, might include coarse rye or barley flour, a sourdough starter, water and salt, sometimes beans or peas crushed into meal, occasionally ground acorns or chestnuts to extend flour, ash or sand from poorly cleaned ovens. This was not luxury food, it was fuel for survival. The weekly cycle. With all the work involved grinding grain, paying the miller, preparing the dough, booking time in the oven, baking became a weekly ritual. For many families, Sunday evening was the time. After church, after labor, after whatever stew or porridge was left, the family prepared dough for the week ahead. The loaves would be baked Sunday night and eaten throughout the week, growing steadily staler. By Thursday or Friday, bread might be dipped in broth, stewed in pottage, or used to thicken soups. In this way, bread wasn't just a food. It was a calendar. Its freshness marked the days. Its presence structured meals. It dictated economy, labor, and hunger. Bread as social marker. What kind of bread you ate said everything about who you were. The nobility ate white bread, sifted and refined, made by hired bakers with fine flour. The clergy ate symbolic bread, communion wafers, host, carefully prepared. Townsfolk had more regular access to bakeries, with options ranging from dark loaves to delicate rolls. Peasants ate what they could. Their bread was survival, not luxury. In famine years, this hierarchy became even more visible. Poor families might eat bark bread made with ground birch bark and chaff. Others mixed clay or sawdust into their dough. These famine loaves were dry, gritty, and often dangerous to health, but they filled the stomach. Hunger at the edges. Bread scarcity was a constant threat. A poor harvest, a greedy miller, or a broken oven could tip a family into starvation. To miss your baking day was to risk a week without solid food. If you had no grain, you had no bread, and without bread, there was little else. Even among the hardworking, bread became a silent barometer of status. A neighbor with a fresh loaf on Thursday might be doing better than one boiling crusts into broth. And yet people adapted. They shared ovens, pooled grain, and passed down baking knowledge. The weekly loaf became not only a meal but a bond between families, neighbors, and generations. An unbaked question. So we ask, why did bread, so simple in form, demand such effort, regulation, and ritual? Was it merely a matter of fuel and facilities, or did the scarcity of fresh bread reflect something deeper about the rhythm of life in a medieval village? What does it mean to live by a loaf that grows older every day? In medieval life, bread was not just food, it was a medium of exchange. In a time when actual coinage was scarce among the lower classes, bread could serve as payment, barter, or obligation. A tenant might pay part of his rent in loaves to the local lord. A laborer might receive bread as part of his daily wages. A beggar might be given a stale crust rather than a coin. This was especially true in monastic contexts. Monasteries, often the wealthiest landholders in a region, distributed bread regularly, sometimes to travelers, sometimes as alms, and sometimes as part of religious charity. In some towns, specific days were set aside for the distribution of bread to the poor. Hard, dark loaves made from rye or barley, yet still a life-saving gift. Even within households, bread held value beyond nutrition. Children were taught to value each piece. Nothing was wasted. The crust from the prior day's loaf might become the next day's trencher, a hard-edged, edible plate that would soak up broth and meat juices before being eaten or fed to animals. In larger manorial estates, the steward or reeve might keep ledgers listing the bread owed or distributed to various tenants. These records reveal a world in which bread wasn't simply sustenance, it was structure. The politics of the loaf. The control of bread production often reflected feudal power dynamics. Lords could restrict peasants from baking in their own homes or from grinding their own grain. These restrictions weren't simply about infrastructure, they were about authority. By requiring peasants to use the lord's oven and lord's mill, landlords ensured a steady income stream and reinforced their dominance over daily life. Even something as intimate as eating could not escape feudal regulation. This sparked resentment. Illegal mills were sometimes hidden in barns. Secret ovens, constructed in woods or under floorboards, allowed a degree of autonomy. But they were dangerous not only because of the risk of punishment, but because ovens could catch fire and spread quickly through timber-framed villages. Over time, tensions around these controls grew. In France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, peasant revolts in the 13th and 14th centuries sometimes listed baking rights among their grievances. To bake freely was to reclaim a bit of liberty. And so, in its own quiet way, bread became a symbol of resistance. Bread in the church. If bread dominated everyday life, it held even greater weight in religious life. Christianity, especially in its medieval Catholic form, revolved around ritual, and no ritual was more central than the Eucharist. The Eucharist involved the transformation of bread into the body of Christ, a theological cornerstone. But this bread was not the heavy sourdough of peasants. It was a fine, white, unleavened wafer, prepared with exacting care by priests or nuns. This contrast reinforced hierarchy. The peasant chewed rough, dark crusts. The priest held aloft a flawless disk. The symbolism was clear: white, pure, divine set against the coarse, impure, worldly. Still, even the humblest loaf could take on sacred significance. Bread was blessed in village festivals, brought as offerings to saints, shrines, and sometimes buried with the dead. Stories of saints multiplying loaves or feeding the poor abound. In famine years, miracle tales often involved bread appearing where none had been. The church encouraged reverence for bread not just because of doctrine, but because it encouraged humility, gratitude, and obedience. Bread in the family. In peasant households, bread defined the family meal. A typical day might begin with a crust dipped in ale or water, followed by midday pottage, a thick stew made from beans, leeks, onions, and whatever herbs could be foraged. Bread would be torn into the bowl to soak up liquid or used to thicken the mix. Dinner might include more pottage or a bit of salted meat if the family was lucky. Bread was present at every meal, but it was not always plentiful. Larger families often had to ration it, especially as the week wore on. Children were taught to eat slowly. Even dogs and chickens were not given fresh bread. The weekly baking cycle shaped how bread was used. Sunday, Monday, freshest slices were eaten as is, sometimes even enjoyed. Tuesday, Thursday, bread grew firmer, better suited to soaking in broth or stews. Friday, Saturday, bread was stale and dry, used as trenchers or broken into gruel. Some households would save crumbs throughout the week in a cloth bag, which could later be added to dumplings or used to coat fried roots if there was any oil to spare. Nothing was wasted. Bread famine and fear. Behind every weekly baking lay an unspoken fear. What if there's no flour next week? Crop failure was common. A wet summer could rot the wheat. A dry spring could stunt the rye. Insect infestations, war, and disease could reduce harvests drastically. And since most peasants lived harvest to harvest, a bad year meant a lean winter. In such times, bread became thinner, grayer, more desperate. Historians speak of famine bread loaves stretched with bean husks or pea shells, tree bark, especially birch, ground acorns, boiled to remove bitterness, straw or hay finely chopped, sawdust, dangerously indigestible. Eating this kind of bread was risky. Digestive illness followed, but the alternative was starvation. Famines occurred somewhere in Europe almost every decade. In those years, bread loomed large in the imagination. People dreamed of loaves. They prayed for wheat. They rioted at markets. Bread became a metaphor for God's mercy or his absence. The artisan bakers of towns. In cities and market towns, the story was slightly different. Their professional bakers ran ovens year-round. Townspeople, merchants, craftsmen, students bought bread daily. Regulations governed weight, ingredients, and price. In England, the assize of bread, a 13th-century law, established strict controls to prevent profiteering. These bakers were watched closely. A loaf underweight or overpriced could lead to fines or public shamming. In some places, bakers who cheated were made to ride through town with loaves tied around their necks. Still, urban bread was more varied. White bread for the rich, brown bread for workers, mixed grain bread for the poor. Rolls, cakes, and honey loaves appeared at fairs. Yet even here, bread was never taken for granted. A missed delivery, a burnt batch, or a flour shortage could spark protest. So whether in city or countryside, the baking of bread was always just below the surface of tension, both domestic and political. The evolution of taste. Over time, people developed preferences. Some villages favored rye, others barley. In England, maslin bread, a mix of rye and wheat, became common. In France, pain de maïs, half rye, half wheat, fed much of the population. Italy saw more use of spelt and chestnuts. These regional flavors shaped local identity. Bread became a marker of place, even as it marked time. It also shaped digestion. Heavy breads were filling, but hard on the stomach. Constipation was a common complaint, one reason herbal remedies were prized. To eat bread every day was not always pleasant, but it was normal. The aches, the cramps, the tooth wear, all accepted as part of life. A crumb of curiosity. Still, we wonder, what did it feel like to wait for bread? To know that each bite brought you closer to the bottom of the loaf, that hunger might rise before the next baking day came. Did the smell of Sunday's baking fill villagers with joy or with anxiety? To a medieval peasant, bread was not only sustenance, it was memory in edible form. The smell of baking loaves on Sunday evening, the sound of knives cutting into a dense crust on Monday morning, the sight of a half loaf disappearing by Wednesday, all these patterns etched themselves into the rhythm of a peasant's week. Children grew up measuring time by the bread. The day after baking, before the bread ran out, after the bread was gone. For many, it was the only reliable constant in an unpredictable life. Fields failed, livestock sickened, but the effort to bake, however modest, anchored the household in something familiar. Even songs and rhymes carried echoes of bread. In lullabies, mothers promised their children a bite of warm crust. In prayers, loaves were symbols of comfort or reward. Villagers remembered each other's kindness not by gold or goods, but by the sharing of bread during hard winters or long fasts. Bread connected people not only to their present but also to their past. A family might shape its loaves a certain way, long and narrow, or round and ridged, just as their grandparents had. These simple traditions, passed without ceremony, carried the weight of generations. Bread and the supernatural. Bread was also entangled in the magical and spiritual life of medieval people. Beyond its religious symbolism, it was thought to hold protective and healing powers. Some of these beliefs included crumbs under the bed to ward off nightmares, a crust in the pocket for good luck during travel, a cross scored into a loaf, before baking to let the devil out. Charred pieces mixed into potions or fed to animals as cures. Bread from the Easter bake was considered especially powerful. It might be saved all year and crumbled into stews during storms or plagues. In regions of Eastern Europe, some loaves were buried at field edges to ensure a good harvest. Even moldy bread had meaning. Blue mold growing on the surface of an old loaf wasn't always discarded. Some herbalists believed it could be used as a poultice, an early folk understanding of what would later become penicillin. And when someone died, a piece of bread was sometimes left with the body or placed under the tongue to ease their passage, or ensure they were not hungry in the next life. The silence of the oven. Perhaps the most telling sign of hardship was when no bread was baked at all. An oven left cold was a symbol of absence. No grain, no flour, no fuel, no hope. In villages struck by famine or plague, bread ovens stood unused. Grass might grow in the cracks. Ash clung to the walls from the last, forgotten batch. Silence surrounded them. No loaves to mark the week. No scent to draw the children in. No marks carved into dough to identify who they belonged to because they belonged to no one now. The absence of bread was more than hunger. It was social and spiritual rupture. For this reason, bread also played a role in recovery. After a disaster, war, fire, pestilence, the return of baking was one of the first signs of life returning to normal. A village might celebrate its first bake after a plague year. New loaves would be blessed, ovens scrubbed clean, dough carefully kneaded by old hands. The fire was lit, the bread rose, and with it spirits rose too. Bread and gender. While men often controlled the economy around grain planting, harvesting, milling, the making of bread was primarily a female task. Women shaped dough, tended sourdough starters, carried flour to the oven, and monitored the bake. This domestic work was not only physically demanding but deeply tied to a woman's reputation. A well-baked loaf could signal skill, order, and care. A collapsed or burnt loaf might raise questions about a woman's diligence or invite gossip from neighbors. Young girls were taught from early ages to mix flour and water, to know how the dough should feel between the fingers, to recognize a too-hot oven by the sound of crackling crusts or the smell of scorched flour. Some women became village experts known for their consistency, their skill with mixed flours, or their ability to stretch grain in lean years. In some cases, these women became paid bakers, responsible for feeding entire communities. Still, the majority baked for their own kin, and in the simple act of kneading, they passed down centuries of knowledge, stored not in books but in muscle memory and observation. The weekly cycle and the weight of waiting. By Friday, the bread was stale, the crust was hard, the center was dry. Families soaked it in broth or ale. Children gnawed on the edges. Teeth wore down. Stomachs groaned. And always people waited for Sunday to come again. The cycle never stopped. Each week, flour was measured, salt added, dough kneaded, and bread baked. The act of waiting for the oven, for the flour, for the rising dough was part of the experience, and it was communal. You waited along with your neighbors. You planned meals together. You shared when someone's batch failed. And when the bread finally came out of the oven burnished and warm, marked with the family's symbol, it was more than food. It was victory over time, over hunger, over uncertainty. Even if it only lasted a day or two. Bread's place in the bigger picture. Looking at medieval bread making might seem trivial compared to wars, kings, and cathedrals. But in truth, the history of bread is the history of survival. It touches on nearly every aspect of medieval life. Economy, tithes, rents, barter. Religion, communion, fasting, ritual. Law, baking rites, assizes, punishments. Gender, women's labor, domestic knowledge. Community, sharing ovens, feasting, fasting. Health, nutrition, famine, food safety. And beneath it all was the simple, quiet truth. Most people were hungry most of the time. Bread, however coarse, however stale, kept them going. Final reflection. When we think of history, we often look to the grand, the violent, or the extraordinary. But sometimes, the most telling stories are those that rise slowly, brown unevenly, and grow stale too fast. So we ask, what might our own lives look like if measured not in minutes or calendars, but in loaves? If each week rose and fell with the smell of baking bread? In a world of abundance, can we still imagine a time when the hard crust of a week-old loaf was the most precious thing you owned? Story 3. Parchment and Patience, Copying Texts in a Monastic Scriptorium. You step into a cool, dimly lit room. The air is still. Dust hangs gently in the filtered light, which seeps through narrow windows made of horn or oiled parchment. The only sound is the faint scratch of quill on vellum, slow, deliberate, persistent. This is the scriptorium, the writing room of a medieval monastery. Here, time moves differently. There is no clatter of horses or shouts from the village. Instead, there is a different rhythm: the turn of a page, the cutting of a quill, the gentle breath of a monk leaning over a desk. Every movement has meaning, every word is placed with care, because in this room books are born. In the centuries before the printing press, every manuscript had to be copied by hand, and most of that copying happened in places like this: monastic scriptoria tucked inside abbeys and priories, staffed by monks whose lives were dedicated to silence, prayer, and the written word. But copying texts was not a glamorous task. It was slow, physically painful, and often thankless, and yet it formed the backbone of medieval knowledge. Without this work, entire libraries of classical and religious writing might have vanished. Who were the scribes? The men who worked in the scriptorium were usually monks, although lay scribes were sometimes hired when demand grew high. These monks followed a strict daily schedule centered on prayer, communal meals, and labor, of which copying was one type. Not every monk became a scribe. It required good eyesight, steady hands, patience, and above all, obedience. You had to follow instructions exactly. Copying texts wasn't about personal expression. It was about accuracy. Creativity was reserved for the margins. A scribe might begin training as a teenager, learning Latin, script styles, and the basic forms of illuminated letters. But even after years of experience, he would be corrected, watched, and tested. A single mistake, a missing word or wrong line, could ruin days of work. And yet many scribes found peace in the repetition. It was a kind of meditation, silent, slow, and structured. In a chaotic world of plagues, war, and famine, the act of writing offered order. The tools of the trade. Copying a manuscript required more than a quill and ink. It was a process with many stages and many tools. 1. Parchment or vellum. The writing surface was almost always animal skin, usually from sheep, goats, or calves. Preparing parchment was a laborious task. Skins were soaked in lime, scraped with knives to remove hair and flesh, then stretched on wooden frames to dry. The result was a durable, smooth surface that could be written on both sides. 2. Quills. The main writing instrument was the feather quill, usually from a goose. Quills had to be regularly trimmed with small knives called penknives to keep their tips sharp. A single day's copying could wear down several quills. 3. Ink. Ink was handmade, usually from oak galls, growths on oak trees caused by insects, iron salts, and gum arabic. The mixture created a rich black ink that darkened over time. Colored inks for rubrics, red headings, initials, or decoration were made from natural pigments like saffron, yellow, lapis lazuli, blue, or vermilion, red. 4. Rulers and styluses. Before writing, the scribe had to rule the page. Using a stylus or lead point, he drew faint lines to guide the script. These lines helped ensure uniformity and alignment. 5. Desk and writing board. Most monks wrote at sloped wooden desks or portable lap desks. Manuscripts in progress were often secured with straps or weights to prevent slipping. 6. Scrapers and erasers. Mistakes were inevitable. To fix them, scribes used knives to scrape off ink gently, then polished the surface smooth again. This left subtle scars on the parchment still visible today to scholars. The work of copying. The actual act of writing was slow. A single monk might spend a year or more copying one book. Even short works could take weeks. There was no rush. Accuracy mattered more than speed. Scribes copied both religious and secular texts. The Bible, of course, was the most copied book, often transcribed with reverence and ritual. But other texts filled the desks too: works by Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine, and Boethius. Medicine, grammar, astronomy, history, all were deemed worthy of copying. Copying meant more than just words. Each page required structure. Chapters, headings, paragraph marks, and capital letters had to be planned. Decorative initials were often left blank for another specialist, the illuminator, to complete. Some scriptoria used a system of exemplars, a master copy from which multiple scribes worked in parallel. Others used a more solitary method, with one scribe copying a single book from start to finish. A monk might write for hours each day, especially during the colder seasons when farming tasks lessened. In summer, the ink dried too fast. In winter, fingers stiffened with cold. But regardless of season, the work continued. The physical toll. Scribing was hard on the body. Monks sat hunched for hours, neck bent, shoulders tense. Their fingers cramped, eyes strained in the dim light. The ink stained their hands. Dust from parchment irritated their lungs. In some cases, scribes complained of failing eyesight, arthritis, or even mental fatigue. Marginal notes reveal some of this frustration. One scribe wrote at the end of a manuscript, "Let the reader not blame the writer, for the letters are dim, and he is very tired." Another wrote, "Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, it dims your sight, it twists your stomach and your sides." Still, these complaints were rare. Most scribes endured the discomfort without comment. They believed their work was service to God. Mistakes, marginalia, and small acts of rebellion. Though scribes were expected to be obedient, their personalities sometimes slipped through. In the margins of manuscripts, we find doodles, jokes, and commentary. Some drew small faces peeking from behind letters. Others sketched animals, devils, or imaginary beasts. Some made snide remarks about the quality of the exemplar or the competence of previous scribes. One famously wrote, "This book was copied by a reluctant scribe." Another, "The ink is thin, the parchment is hairy, and I am very cold." These quiet notes give life to men we otherwise know little about. They remind us that behind each careful line was a human being, tired, often bored, occasionally mischievous. A question of legacy. And so we ask, did these monks know their work would last centuries? Did they feel the weight of preservation? Or were they simply following orders, copying one line at a time, never imagining that the margins of their labor would one day be read in awe by future generations? In their silence, did they ever wonder who would turn the pages they so carefully filled? The image of a quiet monk hunched over parchment may feel serene, but the monastic scriptorium was never a neutral space. It was deeply connected to institutional power, religious, political, and cultural. Every book copied by hand was a curated version of knowledge, a reflection of what someone, an abbot, bishop, or monarch, deemed worth preserving. Scriptoria didn't just passively record history, they shaped it. What was copied, what was left out, what was corrected or edited, these decisions had ripple effects across centuries. Texts were not merely duplicated, they were filtered through the worldview of their copyists. For example, a manuscript of a classical Roman author might be copied with Christianized annotations. A heretical gospel might be altered or destroyed. A historical chronicle might be expanded to emphasize the greatness of a particular patron or monastery. The pen in those dim scriptoria was not just a tool, It was an instrument of cultural control. What got copied and what didn't. Despite the enormity of the copying effort, only a small fraction of ancient literature survived into the Middle Ages. Much was lost not necessarily through malice, but through neglect and prioritization. The books that did get copied over and over were the Bible, in various translations and commentaries, writings of the Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Gregory the Great, liturgical texts, psalters, breviaries, missals, saints' lives and miracles, hagiographies, canon law and theological treatises. But monks also copied classical philosophy, Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, grammar and rhetoric manuals, medical texts from Galen and Hippocrates, astronomy and mathematics from Arabic sources. Yet for every work that survived, hundreds vanished. Plays, secular poetry, and philosophical arguments that didn't serve religious or educational purposes were often overlooked. In some cases, manuscripts were scraped clean and reused, creating what we now call palimpsests. So, in a very real way, our view of the past has been shaped by these decisions, made silently and without fanfare in scriptoriums across Europe. The illuminators, art in the margins. Not all monks copied texts. Some specialized in illumination, the decoration of manuscripts with gold, silver, and vibrant pigments. Illuminators added initial letters the size of palms, filled with vines, dragons, or saints. Margins might feature entire narrative scenes, a fox preaching to geese, a knight battling a snail, or an angel blowing a trumpet. The work of illumination was time-consuming and required its own tools. Brushes made from squirrel hair, gold leaf applied with gesso or glare egg white, ground minerals like lapis lazuli, cinnabar, and malachite, parchment smoothers made of polished bone. Illuminated manuscripts weren't just beautiful, they were statements of wealth and prestige. A fully illuminated Bible could take years to produce and cost as much as a small farm. These books were often commissioned by kings, bishops, or wealthy abbeys, meant to impress visitors or glorify God. The Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Winchester Bible are just a few dazzling examples. But even less ornate books bore modest flourishes, simple red initials, rubricated headings, or decorative borders. These were signs that someone cared enough to make the page more than just a container of words. Collaboration in the copying process. Manuscript production was rarely a solo task. A single book might pass through dozens of hands before completion. A typical process looked something like this. Selection: the abbot or librarian decided what needed copying. Parchment preparation: skins were ordered, cut, and ruled. Exemplar review: a master text was chosen, checked for errors. Copying: scribes copied assigned sections. Correction: another monk reviewed the manuscript for accuracy. Illumination: margins, initials, and illustrations were added. Binding: pages were sewn into quires, bound in wooden boards and leather. This assembly line approach became more common in larger scriptoria, especially by the 12th century. Monasteries like Monte Cassino, St. Gall, and the Abbey of Cluny developed reputations as manuscript powerhouses. Sometimes, mistakes in one scribe's section would lead to changes in later sections, creating textual variants that still puzzle scholars today. One copyist might modernize a spelling, while another preserved the older form. These subtle decisions ripple across manuscripts and centuries. The role of the librarian. Every monastery had a librarian, often called the armarius, who oversaw the scriptoria and the library. He was responsible for assigning texts, managing parchment supply, storing inks, and enforcing standards. He also tracked the manuscripts themselves. Libraries kept book lists, some of which still survive, telling us what books existed where and in what quantity. Books were chained to shelves, not for theft prevention in the modern sense, but because they were so valuable. A single large manuscript could take years to produce and represented countless labor hours. If a monk borrowed a book for study, his name and the date were recorded. Some abbeys required written promises, book curses, warning of divine wrath should the book be stolen or mistreated. One popular version read, "Whoever steals this book, may he die the death. May he be fried in the pan. May the falling sickness and fever seize him." The librarian ensured that the labor of the scriptorium was preserved not just in parchment, but in practice. Changes across centuries. Scriptoria evolved over time. In the early Middle Ages, they were small, isolated, and deeply religious in function. By the High Middle Ages, 12th-13th centuries, many monasteries expanded their operations, copying texts for universities and scholars across Europe. In this later period, secular book production also grew. Lay scribes worked in urban centers like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. Books were made faster, with simpler scripts on cheaper parchment. But monastic scriptoria still held authority. They were seen as keepers of tradition, guardians of sacred and ancient knowledge. It was this tension between old and new, sacred and secular, that defined the twilight years of the scriptorium. A whisper of doubt. But as the 15th century dawned and the printing press loomed just over the horizon, one wonders, did any monk sense that his painstaking labor was nearing its end? Did he glance at his ink-stained fingers and wonder if the next generation would need them at all? Did the quiet halls of the scriptorium ever echo with the first tremors of obsolescence? A medieval manuscript was more than a text. It was an artifact of collective labor, inked by hand, bound with sinew, and preserved by willpower. Every page carried the weight of time, from the animal whose skin formed the parchment to the monk whose aching fingers formed its letters. The final product could be thick and heavy, bound in wooden boards wrapped in leather. Some had clasps to hold them shut, or bosses metal knobs on the corners to protect them when laid on hard surfaces. Others were smaller, simpler, pocket-sized psalters, used for daily prayer with only minimal decoration. Regardless of size or splendor, every book was a victory over impermanence. Books fought against decay, war, and oblivion, and in many ways they succeeded. Thanks to the monks of the scriptoria, hundreds of ancient texts, religious, scientific, philosophical, survive today. Yet for all that was preserved, much was also lost, and the losses often came quietly. Bookworms, fire, and forgetting. Books were surprisingly fragile. Insects chewed their bindings. Damp rooms rotted their pages. Fires, accidental or deliberate, destroyed entire libraries in hours. But the most common cause of loss was neglect. When a monastery declined, so too did its library. Volumes might be sold, given away, or left to mold in crumbling storage rooms. Pages were pulled for scrap used to line windows, wrap goods, or reinforce bindings for newer books. Some monasteries simply disappeared. Viking raids, political upheaval, or economic collapse led to abandonment, and with them went their books, their scribes, and the quiet memory of their scriptoria. Still, the process of copying endured longer than most assume. Even in the 15th century, decades after Gutenberg's press appeared, monks in some remote regions continued to write by hand, unaware or unbothered by the speed of print. They weren't trying to compete, they were trying to remember. The first printed books, competition or continuity. The arrival of movable type in Europe around 1450 didn't immediately end manuscript copying. In fact, the first printed books incunabula often tried to imitate manuscripts. Early printers designed typefaces that looked like Gothic script. They left space for decorative initials to be added by hand. They printed on vellum, not just paper. For a while, the worlds of manuscript and print coexisted. Wealthy patrons still commissioned hand-copied texts, especially luxury Bibles or classical works. Some even requested manuscripts as personal or devotional items, believing them to carry a spiritual purity that printed books lacked. But the tide could not be turned. Printed books were faster, cheaper, more consistent. One press could produce in weeks what a scribe might spend a year copying. Universities embraced print. So did merchants, reformers, explorers. Books began to multiply beyond the walls of monasteries, beyond the oversight of the church. The monastic scriptorium, once the quiet center of European literacy, faded into the background. The ghosts in the margins. And yet traces of the old scribes remain. In the margins of old books we still find their fingerprints, their comments, their tiny illustrations, their corrections, their prayers, their tired laments. These are not simply historical curiosities, they are human moments, preserved in ink and skin. Some monks signed their work discreetly. Pray for Brother Thomas, who wrote this book. Others left no name, only a habit of lettering, a preference for flourished capitals, a favored Latin abbreviation. Paleographers, modern experts in handwriting, can sometimes identify a specific scribe's hand across multiple books. These monks, long dead, still speak letter by letter. The act of copying, for all its tedium, gave them a kind of immortality. The quiet after the last page. We often imagine historical eras ending with a bang, revolutions, battles, inventions, but the scriptorium ended with silence. Fewer novices were trained, fewer books were ordered, the ink pots dried, the knives dulled, the parchment curled on forgotten shelves. In some monasteries, the rooms were repurposed, turned into storage, dormitories, or allowed to crumble. In others, the desks remained in place, the last copied book resting on a shelf beside the first printed one, a passing of the torch that no one officially declared. The silence was not sad, it was inevitable. The world had changed. What was lost and what was gained? Did something die with the end of hand-copied books? Perhaps. Manuscript culture was deeply personal. No two books were alike. Every margin bore the breath of a scribe. Errors had texture. Ink faded differently across pages. To read a manuscript was to see the human hand at work. Printed books were tidy, efficient, and identical. They democratized reading, spread knowledge, and ignited revolutions. But they also flattened the page, made it more uniform, less intimate. Still, the scribes had done their job. They had bridged the centuries. Without them, the classics of Rome and Greece, the teachings of early Christianity, the first steps of science, all might have been lost in the dark. Their gift was not just the books, but the idea that some things are worth preserving, even when it takes a lifetime. Final reflection. So we ask, when the last scribe in the last scriptorium copied his final line and laid down his quill, did he know what he had done? That he had held open a door long enough for a new world to enter? Or did he simply blow gently on the ink, close the cover, and move to the next prayer? Story 4. Chamber Pots and Cesspits, the hidden labor of medieval sanitation. Close your eyes and imagine walking through a bustling medieval city. The uneven cobblestones under your feet, the low, timber-framed buildings leaning overhead, and the chatter of market stalls spilling out into narrow alleys. But there's something else, something invisible but undeniable that clings to the air. The smell. Because in a world without modern sanitation, the odors of daily life didn't disappear down pipes. They lingered. Waste, both human and animal, was a constant presence, and someone, often many someones, had to deal with it. Sanitation in medieval towns and cities was a complex system of habit, necessity, and improvisation. It was rarely efficient, often unpleasant, and always essential. This was the labor no one romanticizes, but without it, daily life would have collapsed under its own filth. Where the waste went. In medieval urban centers like London, Paris, or Bruges, most buildings had no internal plumbing. Instead, waste disposal relied on a patchwork of options. Chamber pots, These were the most common. Simple ceramic, metal, or wooden pots used to collect urine and feces, especially overnight. Privies, latrines, pit-style toilets located in yards, alleys, or even inside homes. Waste dropped into a cesspit or shaft below. Guardrobes, common in castles and monasteries. These were built into outer walls so waste could fall into the moat or be collected below. Street ditches and open drains. Rainwater channels often doubled as waste conveyors, but they overflowed easily. In many places, the phrase "gardes lo," watch out for the water, was shouted as people emptied chamber pots from upper-story windows into the street below. Travelers learned to hug the walls of buildings to avoid the splash zone. In fact, this may be one reason early sidewalks appeared, a buffer against waste. Cesspits and their keepers. The primary solution for long-term waste storage was the cesspit, a dug hole or stone-lined shaft into which waste flowed or was dumped. Over time, these pits filled and had to be emptied, a task both crucial and revolting. Enter the gong farmer, one of the least respected yet most vital figures in medieval sanitation. Gong farmers, from the Old English gang, meaning to go, were paid to shovel out cesspits often at night to avoid offending passers-by and cart the waste out of the city. Their tools included long-handled shovels, buckets and barrels, ropes for hauling, carts for transporting night soil. They were well paid out of necessity, but often socially shunned. Some cities required them to live outside the main walls. They worked under cover of darkness and were fined if seen working during the day. The waste they collected was dumped in designated dung heaps or reused as fertilizer in nearby fields. In some cases, dried waste was burned. But in most towns, the problem simply relocated from cesspit to countryside. The role of rivers. Rivers were both blessing and curse. Cities needed them for drinking, washing, and trade, but they also used them as natural sewers. Waste from homes, markets, tanneries, and slaughterhouses all flowed into the same waters people drank from. In London, the river Fleet became so clogged with waste that by the 14th century it was known more for its stink than its usefulness. Paris fared no better with the Seine. Even wells, once pristine, became contaminated as seepage from nearby cesspits infiltrated the ground. This led to waterborne diseases, dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and a host of unnamed stomach afflictions. But medieval understanding of disease was limited. People knew bad smells were dangerous, miasma theory, but they didn't grasp microbes. So the rivers continued to carry filth away, and sometimes right back again. Public toilets and communal latrines. Despite the reputation of medieval towns as unhygienic, many cities did attempt to organize sanitation. Some provided public latrines, especially near marketplaces, ports, and major bridges. These facilities varied widely in quality. Simple trench-style latrines, screened by wooden boards. Multi-seat wooden benches over pits. Privies that discharged into rivers or moats. Monasteries, castles, and large institutions often had the best designed facilities, with guardrobes leading to waste shafts, and even rudimentary water flow to clean some systems. The monks of Cluny Abbey, for example, built a sophisticated latrine block with drainage systems. But for the average townsman or peasant, a chamber pot or alleyway sufficed. The street scene. Streets served multiple purposes: walkways, marketplaces, gathering spots, and waste channels. Open gutters ran along the center or sides of streets, meant to carry rain and runoff. But in practice, they became the default waste highways. Rats, flies, and stray dogs were constant companions, but so were street cleaners known in some towns as scavengers or rakers. These workers swept streets, collected refuse, and sometimes transported night soil. Their work, like that of the gong farmers, was poorly regarded but absolutely essential. City ordinances from London to Lubeck reveal attempts to control street dumping, fines for throwing waste into public walkways, rules on how often streets must be cleaned, bans on butchers dumping animal parts, prohibitions on waste disposal near wells. Still, enforcement was spotty. The problem was too big and the people too numerous. The smells of daily life. To live in a medieval town was to live with smells, not just from waste, but from tanneries soaking hides in urine and lime, dyers boiling cloth in pungent vats, slaughterhouses bleeding animals on open stone slabs, markets where fish and meat rotted in summer heat. Smells were normal, not noteworthy. People developed a different threshold, but they also sought ways to manage them. Sweet herbs strewn on floors, scented pomanders, perfumed gloves, and heavily spiced food. Even churches burned incense not just for holiness, but to mask the stench of tightly packed congregants. A question in the air. And so we wonder, in a city where every breath carried the scent of refuse, what did cleanliness mean? Was it a matter of soap and water or simply the absence of visible filth? How do you define hygiene in a world where waste was unavoidable, and the only exit was the gong farmer's cart? When we think of medieval labor, we often picture blacksmiths at the forge, farmers in the fields, or bakers at the oven. But the sanitation workers of the Middle Ages, those who shoveled human waste, cleared gutters, and emptied cesspits, played a role just as vital. They kept towns livable just barely, by removing the constant byproduct of human existence, filth. These individuals were not celebrated in ballads or depicted in tapestries. Their names rarely survive in records, but their labor, though disgusting and dangerous, formed the invisible infrastructure of medieval urban life. The gong farmer's routine. A gong farmer didn't just walk into a cesspit and start digging. Their work followed a rhythm and routine that was deeply embedded in the urban life of the time. Here, how their job typically unfolded. Nightfall, most cesspit cleaning happened after dark, partly to avoid public offense and partly due to city regulations. The darkness also provided some degree of social shielding for those doing the work. Accessing the pit, many privies and cesspits were underground vaults accessible through narrow openings. Gong farmers had to climb down into the pit, often with only a torch or small lantern. Shoveling the waste, using long-handled shovels, they filled buckets or barrels with night soil, human waste and sludge. Lifting and loading, waste was hauled out using ropes or ladders and loaded onto a two-wheeled cart. This was then covered with canvas or straw to contain the smell, though not effectively. Transport and disposal. The waste was taken to designated dumping grounds outside the city, usually in low-lying areas or near fields where it might be used as fertilizer. In some towns, contracts required disposal in remote pits to prevent groundwater contamination. Despite the filth, gong farmers were sometimes paid more than skilled tradesmen, especially when cesspits were full to the brim or located under wealthier homes with stricter standards. Laws and regulations. As medieval towns grew in population, so too did the pressure on sanitation. Civic leaders issued laws and ordinances to try to contain the spread of disease and the accumulation of refuse. Some examples. In London, regulations dating back to the 14th century required waste to be removed from cesspits at least once a year. In Paris, latrine placement was subject to approval to ensure they didn't contaminate nearby wells. In Cologne, fines were levied for tossing waste out windows without warning. Some cities appointed public inspectors, known in some places as rakers or muckmasters, to oversee street and cesspit cleanliness. Still, enforcement was inconsistent. These laws often depended on local complaints, and wealthier residents were more likely to see their concerns addressed. The dangers of the job. The health risks of sanitation labor were extreme. Gong farmers faced toxic gases from decomposing waste, including methane and ammonia, infections and parasites, often through cuts or inhalation, falls and entrapment, as pits collapsed or ladders failed, physical strain from hauling full barrels of wet, heavy sludge. Occasionally, there are grim records of gong farmers dying in cesspits suffocated or drowned in the very waste they were trying to remove. Even the tools of their trade carried danger. Rusted metal, broken wood, or spiked implements could injure hands and feet. Protective clothing was minimal if it existed at all. Some may have wrapped cloth around their faces or worn old leather to shield their skin, but for the most part, they worked exposed. And yet they persisted. Cities could not function without them. Clean streets meant trade could flourish. Empty cesspits meant homes were habitable. Female sanitation workers. Though sanitation work was largely male-dominated, especially cesspit cleaning women also took part in urban waste management. They often filled roles such as street sweepers, especially in markets and near churches, chamber pot cleaners in inns, hospitals, or monasteries, water carriers, who also helped flush waste from courtyards, laundresses, who scrubbed soiled linens in public washhouses, often near waste channels or rivers. These women were part of the broader ecosystem of invisible labor that allowed towns to function. Their work was thankless, tiring, and often stigmatized, but they too played a key role in keeping disease at bay. Waste as a resource. Not all waste was discarded. In a world of scarcity, even filth could be valuable. Night soil, when dried, made decent fertilizer for certain crops. Farmers near cities sometimes purchased it, creating an odd trade in human waste. Urine was used in textile processing, especially in fulling, cleansing, and thickening wool. It helped strip oils from cloth. In tanneries, urine softened hides. In dyeing, ammonia-rich waste served as a mordant to fix colors. So while most people avoided waste, artisans sought it. Some workshops even had contracts with waste collectors for a steady supply of urine or animal dung. This strange economy highlights a medieval truth. Nothing was wasted if it could be reused, even what most would rather forget. Reputation and exclusion. Despite their importance, sanitation workers were often socially marginalized. In some regions, gong farmers were barred from guild membership and excluded from civic events. They might be forced to live in peripheral neighborhoods, near the dung heaps or waste channels. Children of waste workers had limited opportunities. Their family occupation branded them. Yet in desperate times, plague, war, flood, these same people became indispensable. Their exclusion was paradoxical. Society needed them, but didn't want to see or smell them. They existed in a twilight space between labor and invisibility. A question in the gutter. So we ask, what does it mean to be essential but unwanted? To do work everyone relies on but no one respects? And if the cities of the Middle Ages had survived only by the hands of those buried in cesspits and gutters, why are their names lost while the names of kings remain? By the late medieval period, the sheer volume of human waste, animal refuse, and industrial byproducts pouring into the streets and waterways had become more than just unpleasant, it was unmanageable. Cities began to take sanitation more seriously, not because of a modern understanding of disease, but because of economic pressure, social unrest, and religious ideals of purity. A cleaner city was easier to govern, more attractive to trade, and in the church's view, more godly. Thus began the earliest municipal efforts at organized sanitation. These were not comprehensive, nor particularly successful by modern standards, but they were steps toward a public system. Rules, fines, and fear. City authorities issued strict regulations about waste disposal, some of which appear surprisingly detailed and bureaucratic. In 14th century Paris, it was illegal to empty chamber pots into the street between sunrise and nightfall. Bruges mandated that all privies be inspected yearly and cleaned as needed. In York, butchers were fined for leaving entrails in the street beyond sundown. Edinburgh required waste to be carted to designated middens, refused dumps outside town. Violators were often fined, but enforcement was uneven. Some people bribed officials or ignored the rules entirely. Nonetheless, the existence of these laws signals an emerging awareness. Filth wasn't just gross, it was dangerous. Fear, too, played a role. Outbreaks of plague, dysentery, or mysterious fevers were often blamed on corrupt air caused by waste. After a disease outbreak, cities sometimes rushed to clean streets, dig new pits, or hire more night soil collectors. Waste management in religious institutions. Monasteries and abbeys, with their ordered routines and spiritual emphasis on purity, often had the best sanitation systems of the time. Monastic latrines were sometimes positioned over flowing water for natural flushing. Waste pits were regularly cleaned. Monks used lavatoriums, hand-washing stations, before meals and after using the facilities. Cloisters maintained herb gardens with plants that helped combat odor. The monks of Cluny Abbey in France built an elaborate latrine complex that could accommodate dozens of users, with ventilation and waste chutes. Similarly, the Cistercians were known for carefully managed water channels, both for irrigation and waste disposal. These models were rare outside religious life, but inspired urban planning in later centuries. Waste and the architecture of survival. The design of homes and streets in medieval towns reflected the need to manage waste. Even in modest buildings, simple innovations hinted at a practical understanding of the problem. Sloped floors allowed urine to drain toward a corner or bucket. Waste holes in walls allowed chamber pots to be emptied into back alleys or cesspools. Tile or stone floors were easier to clean than packed earth. Threshold drains in some doorways diverted runoff from the street. Buildings were not always unsanitary. By accident, many were constructed with low-tech solutions to reduce disease, even if the science behind them was not fully understood. And beyond the architecture, daily behavior changed too. People avoided certain streets. Markets were relocated to cleaner ground. Wells were covered. Even the wealthy sought homes on higher ground, away from the stink of riverbanks. Public bathhouses and the paradox of cleanliness. Though medieval people are often imagined as dirty, bathing was common in many parts of Europe until at least the 15th century. Public bathhouses, especially in German, French, and Scandinavian cities, served both hygiene and social purposes. Bathhouses were heated, steam-filled, and offered hot water tubs. Some operated on gender-specific days, others had divided spaces. Wealthier citizens had private tubs brought into their homes. But bathhouses also became linked to immorality and disease. During the Black Death and later plagues, they were sometimes closed, accused of spreading illness or encouraging sinful behavior. As fears grew, the culture of public bathing declined. This created a paradox. People were increasingly concerned with sanitation, but abandoned one of their few clean spaces out of fear. Innovations and efforts that did last. Some medieval cities attempted major infrastructure projects to control waste. A few examples. London tried to cover and redirect parts of the Fleet River to reduce stench. Paris constructed new waste channels and stone-lined sewers near the Louvre. Nuremberg built latrine towers over water channels. But many of these improvements were temporary. Funding ran out. Political unrest halted construction. Floods or overuse rendered systems ineffective. It wasn't until the 16th and 17th centuries that large-scale sewer networks began to emerge in earnest. Still, the medieval period laid the groundwork. The idea that a city could and should manage its waste collectively had taken root. What remained in the gutters? Even at their cleanest, medieval cities remained messy, noisy, and malodorous. The basic reality of human waste had not changed. Chamber pots still filled, cesspits still overflowed, gong farmers still scraped and shoveled in the moonlight. But something else had changed: expectation. By the end of the Middle Ages, people began to demand cleaner streets, fresher water, and more predictable waste removal. They saw cleanliness not just as personal piety, but as a civic goal. This shift in thinking would eventually fuel public health reforms, even if centuries later. Final reflection. So when we think of medieval sanitation, we must resist the urge to laugh or gag. Because behind every foul-smelling alley and overflowing cesspit was a system imperfect, laborious, but absolutely necessary. A system built on the backs of people whose names history forgot. And perhaps we should ask, in our own age of hidden plumbing and invisible disposal, have we really moved so far? Or have we simply buried our waste beneath concrete and with it, our memory of the people who once carried it away by hand? Story 5. A penny for the candle, life after sunset before gaslight. Before electricity, before gaslight, and even before widely affordable candles, nightfall brought a very different world than we know today. The sun dipped below the horizon, and with it vanished the familiar faces blurred, streets disappeared, work halted. For much of history, night was not just dark, it was dangerous, disorienting, and deeply symbolic. In the medieval and early modern world, people feared the dark not only for what it concealed, but for what it allowed to awaken: thieves, spirits, animals, and the wandering thoughts of the sleepless. The ordinary routines of daily life had to adapt. Work schedules, religious practice, social customs, and even architecture were shaped by one reality: when the sun set, your world shrank. Time measured by flame. The most basic challenge after sunset was simple: seeing. Without affordable, accessible light, most people relied on primitive sources of illumination. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were cheap but smoky, with an acrid smell and a tendency to sputter. Rushlights, thin reeds dipped in grease or fat, provided a few minutes of flickering light enough to find a chamber pot or check on a sleeping child. Oil lamps, more common in wealthier homes, burned fish or vegetable oil in clay or metal vessels. Wood fires in hearths or open braziers offered both heat and light, but were dangerous and impractical to move. A candle might burn for an hour, a rushlight for 15 minutes. People learned to ration light, using it sparingly and deliberately. The phrase "burning the candle at both ends" reflected literal wastefulness. The economics of illumination. Light was not free, and that meant the dark was not evenly distributed. The wealthy could afford beeswax candles, brighter, longer burning, and pleasantly scented. The middle class might buy tallow candles in bundles, often made at home or by local chandlers. The poor relied on scraps, leftover grease, a bundle of rushes, a smoldering log. Chandlers, the candle makers, were often part of urban guilds, and their products were carefully measured and sold by weight. In some cities, candle prices were regulated, as they were considered an essential commodity like bread or ale. Records from 17th century England show that a single tallow candle could cost a penny, a significant sum for a laborer. For many, lighting a candle was a conscious decision, reserved for tasks too important to leave until morning. Some inns or boarding houses charged extra for candle use. In certain poor households, the entire evening passed by firelight alone or in darkness. Life by firelight. Those who could afford a hearth fire often kept it burning after dark. Around it, people gathered to complete small tasks: mending clothes, telling stories, praying or reading aloud, preparing food for the next day. The fire became the center of the household, not just for warmth but for orientation. Its glow lit only a few feet beyond its base. Shadows danced on the walls. Movement beyond that was obscured. Many older homes were built with inglenooks, recessed spaces around the hearth where people could sit close, shielded from drafts. Here, elders might recount folk tales and children would learn them by firelight. In rural communities, oral tradition thrived because of the dark. The hours of sleep. Night shaped not only what people did, but how they slept. Historians have uncovered evidence that, before the widespread use of artificial lighting, many people slept in two distinct phases. First, sleep, beginning shortly after nightfall and lasting until around midnight. A waking period, used for prayer, reflection, conversation, or even light chores. Second, sleep, lasting until dawn. This segmented sleep pattern was natural in a world without clocks or constant light. People allowed their bodies to follow circadian rhythms, guided by the sun and the fire. The concept of 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep is, in fact, a modern construct. The hours between first and second sleep were considered spiritually potent. Manuals of devotion included prayers for this time. Lovers whispered. Farmers checked animals. Occasionally, neighbors might meet by agreement. The dark, in this sense, created a space of intimacy and slowness. Darkness outside the home. To leave one's home after sunset was an act of intention or desperation. Streets were unlit, muddy, and dangerous. Footpaths, thieves lurked in alleyways. Night watchmen patrolled cities, carrying lanterns and staffs, crying the hour and calling out disturbances. In some cities, residents were required to carry lanterns or torches if out after dark. Travel was discouraged. In rural areas, lanterns with horn panes or open flame torches helped guide the way, but they illuminated little. The line between road and ditch was easily lost in the shadows. In London, the cry of the watch might sound. 1 o'clock in a fair night. But not everyone felt safe. The dark was the domain of the unknown, and to walk through it was to take your chances. Religion and the night. Night held religious weight, too. Darkness represented both divine mystery and demonic temptation. Monasteries scheduled vigils and night prayers known as matins or nocturnes in the small hours, believing that the soul was most receptive then. Folklore brimmed with tales of spirits, ghosts, and nocturnal demons. The absence of light blurred the lines between this world and the next. Saints were often said to have visions or revelations in the dark hours, when the senses were dulled and the soul more alert. The church warned against idle activity at night, but for some, the dark became a time of reflection, penitence, or even quiet rebellion. A question in the shadows. And so we wonder, what was lost when the darkness receded, when night no longer closed the day but simply lit a different version of it? Was something sacred, some rhythm of sleep, silence, or story, left behind in the glow of a candle, no longer too expensive to burn? In a world without switches, batteries, or glowing screens, fire was everything. It cooked, it warmed, it protected, and above all, it lit the night. The fire was not something to take lightly. Starting a new one was time-consuming, tinder, flint, and patience. For this reason, many households kept their hearths burning continuously, feeding embers through the night, banking them carefully under ash to preserve the coals until morning. Fire was a living presence in the home, and like all living things, it required tending. Children were taught from an early age to feed and manage it. It was also dangerous. Homes were made of timber and thatch. A single overturned candle or unwatched hearth could consume an entire street. But people learned to live with fire's unpredictability. And in the hours after sunset, fire was their only ally against the long dark. Candle making, from fat to flame. By the later Middle Ages and into the early modern period, candle making or chandlery became a recognized craft. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, especially in towns and cities. Two types of candles dominated the market. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, these were cheap and common, but they smoked, smelled unpleasant, and dripped profusely. In cold climates, they hardened and sometimes cracked. Beeswax candles, bright, clean burning, and fragrant, they were reserved for churches, nobility, and the wealthy. The church, in particular, demanded beeswax for use at altars, believing it symbolized purity. The process of making candles was labor-intensive. Tallow had to be rendered a smelly and messy task that involved boiling and skimming animal fat. Wicks made from twisted plant fibers were dipped repeatedly in the hot fat or wax, with each layer allowed to cool before the next. Finished candles were trimmed, bundled, and stored in cool, dry places to prevent softening or warping. Chandlers often operated near butchers, since they relied on fat as a raw material. The scent of these shops, an odd mix of grease and smoke, was familiar in every city. Some households made their own tallow candles, especially during the annual butchering season when fat was plentiful. But many simply bought what they could afford, 1 penny at a time. Lanterns and lamps. Candles weren't always used bare. They were placed into lanterns, especially when carried outside. These early lanterns came in many forms. Metal frames with horn or mica panels. Glass was rare and expensive. Punched tin designs, allowing flickering light to escape through tiny patterns. Open baskets with candles secured inside for street use. Lamps, meanwhile, were often fueled by fish oil or olive oil, particularly in warmer regions. A small wick sat in a pool of oil, producing a steady but dim flame. They smelled fishy and smoked easily. Wealthy homes sometimes displayed glass oil lamps imported from Italy or the Islamic world, symbols of refinement as well as function. But for the majority, lighting was a struggle for sufficiency. Enough to see, enough to pray, enough to mend a shirt. Lighting the public realm. As cities grew, the question emerged: how do you light a street? For centuries, the answer was, you don't. Streets after sunset were left to the moon and stars, or to the occasional torch-bearing patrolman. But by the 17th century, some cities began to experiment. Paris, under Louis XIV, introduced the first large-scale street lighting system, installing thousands of lanterns fueled by oil, each managed by lamplighters. London, in 1684, passed laws requiring citizens to hang lanterns outside their homes from Michaelmas, September 29, through Lady Day, March 25. These had to be lit from dusk until midnight. Still, these systems were rudimentary, expensive, and labor-intensive. Most towns remained dark places, especially in winter. Private citizens took precautions. Some carried personal lanterns. Others hired linkboys. Young boys paid a few coins to run ahead holding torches, guiding gentlemen home from the tavern or theater. Linkboys were often associated with pickpockets or petty thieves, adding to their shady reputation. Rituals of closing the day. Nightfall in the pre-industrial world wasn't just a shift in light, it was a shift in being. Families closed shutters, latched doors, and settled into smaller, quieter spaces. The day's energy ebbed into a rhythm of reflection, stillness, and precaution. Candles were extinguished with care, using snuffers or fingers moistened with saliva. Beds were warmed with heated bricks or iron pans filled with embers, wrapped in cloth. Evening prayers were said by the fire or at the bedside, lit by the final stub of a candle. Some households performed a safety sweep, checking for open flames before sleep. The fear of fire was ever present. The act of blowing out a candle was more than habit, it was symbolic. It marked the end of the day, the return of darkness, and the beginning of a long, uncertain stretch of hours until the sun returned. The sounds of the night. With vision limited, people became attuned to sound. The night was alive with it. The howl of wind through wooden shutters, the creak of beams and rafters settling, the distant bark of dogs, the echo of hooves on cobbled streets, the call of a night watchman, the chime of a far-off church bell marking the hours. Some found these sounds soothing, others terrifying. In rural areas, the night could be eerily quiet, broken only by the hoot of an owl or the rustle of an unseen creature. Stories of nocturnal apparitions abounded of ghosts, banshees, or witches. The dark invited the imagination to fill what the eye could not see, and in that void, superstition thrived. Literacy and the night. Ironically, as books became more available in the late Middle Ages and early modern era, the lack of reliable light limited access to them. Even literate people had to choose when and how to read. Candlelight was dim and inconsistent, and reading for long periods could strain the eyes. Still, in homes that could afford it, nighttime reading became a treasured activity. Families gathered for a loud reading, often of religious texts, saints' lives, or moral tales. In wealthier circles, novels and plays entered the scene. The candle became a symbol of intellectual pursuit, not just necessity. It lit the minds of monks, scientists, poets, and dreamers. But for the poor, it remained too expensive to burn for long. A flickering thought. So we ask, in an age where light was precious, did people savor it more? Did the glow of a single candle carry more weight than 1,000 modern bulbs? And what did it mean to trust your thoughts to the dark, to whisper them by firelight, knowing the flame might die before your story was told? As candles sputtered and embers dulled, the medieval and early modern household entered a state of quiet drift, not quite sleep, not fully awake. The hearth's heat radiated outward in shrinking circles, and shadows claimed the corners of rooms. This was the domain of liminal hours, the stretch between first sleep and second sleep, documented in historical records and personal diaries alike. In the 16th century, a medical manual suggested that the time between sleeps was perfect for conception, the body being rested, and the mind calm. A French physician noted that many rise after midnight for meditation, conversation, or the emptying of the bowels. Sleep, it turns out, wasn't always a solid block. It was a rhythm, a natural ebb and flow in tune with the limitations and textures of night. Watchmen, servants, and the night shift. Even as most households slept in stages, some individuals remained fully awake through the night. These people, watchmen, nurses, grooms, and servants, formed the hidden workforce of the dark. In cities, night watchmen patrolled with lanterns and clubs, crying the hour and weather. 3 o'clock and all is well. Some cities rotated the watch among able-bodied male citizens. Others hired professionals, often former soldiers or laborers. Their presence was more performative than effective. Few could stop a determined thief, but their cries structured the night. Servants, particularly in wealthier homes, often kept a small fire going in the kitchen and rose early to fetch water, stoke the ovens, or prepare tea and porridge before dawn. Stable boys or grooms watched over livestock. In colder months, they slept in haylofts or barns to protect animals from illness or theft. In hospitals and convents, nuns or lay nurses made nighttime rounds, checking on the sick by candlelight. Their eyes adjusted, their ears sharpened, their lives moved by different rules, tethered to flame and darkness. Their labor, largely invisible to history, sustained the sleep of others. Midnight anxieties. Without distractions like electricity or devices, nighttime often invited reflection, and with it, anxiety. Farmers lay awake worrying about failed crops or frost. Widows listened for sounds of intrusion. Merchants rehearsed debts owed or deals made. Mothers listened for the coughs of children. In many homes, small devotional objects, crosses, amulets, Relics rested near beds to protect against bad dreams or spirits. Some families sprinkled holy water or muttered protective prayers when extinguishing the final light. Superstitions grew in the dark. Many believed that witches traveled at night, that devils whispered to the sleepless, or that one's soul was most vulnerable between midnight and dawn. The absence of artificial light made the mind's shadows seem longer. Stillness gave rise to stories. Silence gave shape to fears. Domestic disruption, fires, and illness. Some of the greatest dangers of the night came not from imagined fears but tangible threats. Fire, an unattended ember or fallen candle, could engulf a home. Many towns required shutters to be closed and hearths covered after a certain hour. Fire watching became a key duty in households. Illness, fever spikes often came in the early hours. Families kept bowls of water, vinegar cloths, or herbal drafts ready. In larger homes, servants were trained in basic nursing. Birth and death, both frequently occurred at night. Midwives were summoned with lanterns, sometimes walking miles through cold and dark to attend a laboring mother. When death came in the night, candles were lit around the body, and vigils began before sunrise. The night, then, was not only a time of rest, it was also a time when life changed in quiet, unseen ways. The rooster's cry and the end of darkness. Before alarm clocks, roosters, church bells, and natural light marked the return of day. The first glimmers of dawn lit high windows or peeked beneath shutters. The air felt colder before it warmed. The world stirred again. Fires were stoked. Ovens reheated. Water was fetched from wells. Bread dough, prepared the night before, was set to bake. Fields were walked, doors unlatched. This moment between dark and day carried a kind of reverence. Even those who dreaded labor or hardship welcomed the sight of shadows receding, of walls regaining their color, of faces visible again. The household began to reassemble. Night had passed again, and with its passing the relief that this time nothing went wrong. Light as transformation. The coming of artificial light in the 19th century, first gas lamps, then electric bulbs, would fundamentally alter this rhythm. Suddenly, the segmented sleep pattern collapsed into one. Shops stayed open late. Cities glowed after sunset. People worked longer, played later, traveled further. Light made night less dangerous, but also less intimate. Its arrival meant the decline of the household hearth, of candle-lit reading, of watchmen's cries, and of the contemplative silence between dusk and dawn. As the night filled with new sights and sounds, it lost much of its old mystery, but also perhaps some of its wisdom. A thought to take into the dark. When we extinguish our bedside light with a click, when we fall asleep to a glowing screen or walk under neon signage, we leave behind a different world, a world where a penny bought a flame, and where that flame shaped how we lived, slept, feared, prayed, and loved. Do we understand night better now that we've conquered it? Or did we understand it more deeply when it was still something to endure and to wait out, one candle at a time? Story 6. Bread and Beer, the Forgotten Science of Medieval Kitchens. Bread in the medieval world was not merely food, it was foundation. It accompanied every meal, sustained every class, and in times of scarcity, marked the line between survival and suffering. In a society without supermarkets, standardized ovens, or pre-measured flour, the making of bread was both an art and a gamble. To us, bread is simple, but in a medieval kitchen, it was the product of unpredictable weather, shifting seasons, regional customs, communal labor, and experimental chemistry conducted with wooden troughs, stone mills, and sheer guesswork. Understanding medieval bread is to step into a world where daily nourishment was a community affair, shaped not just by technique, but by tradition, trial, and necessity. Flour was not just flour. The starting point for bread was grain, but not all grain was created equal. Wheat, ideal for light, airy loaves, was expensive and often reserved for the wealthy or for church offerings. Rye, more robust and better suited to cold, northern climates, was darker, denser, and more sour. Barley and oats were common among the poor, particularly in coastal and upland regions. In times of dearth, people mixed in peas, beans, acorns, or even tree bark not for flavor, but to stretch their flour. Grinding the grain was itself a process. Most villages had access to a watermill or windmill, operated by local millers who took a portion of each sack in exchange for service. The resulting flour was often coarse, stone-flecked, and variable. There were no universal recipes. The flour's quality depended on weather, season, storage, and age. Medieval cooks adjusted by feel, by instinct, and by sight. The mystery of the leaven. Before packets of commercial yeast, fermentation was a mystery. Leavening agents came from natural sourdough starters, cultures of wild yeast and bacteria maintained over days, weeks, or even generations. To begin, a baker might mix flour and water into a soft dough. Leave it exposed to air for days until it began to bubble. Feed it daily with fresh flour, sometimes adding fruits or ale to encourage activity. The result was sour, slow-acting, and unreliable. Temperature, humidity, and luck shaped the rise. A hot day could speed the process. A cold cellar could delay it for hours. Because of this, timing bread required vigilance. Bakers often rose before dawn, judged their starter's readiness by smell and texture, and kept doughs warm using residual oven heat or blankets. A failed starter meant wasted grain, a serious economic blow. Success, however, was celebrated with the smell of rising loaves and the promise of a well-fed day. Ovens were shared. Most medieval households did not have their own oven. Building one required space, skill, and access to fuel luxuries that many lacked. Instead, communities used communal ovens, often run by the manor, the church, or a local baker. Here how it worked. Families prepared their dough at home, kneading it in wooden troughs, shaping it into rounds or batards. They carried the dough to the communal oven, often marking it with a personal symbol or using a unique cloth. The oven master placed each loaf inside with a long peel and returned it hours later, deducting a portion or fee as payment. Ovens were heated by burning wood to high heat, then raking out the coals and loading in the loaves. There were no thermometers, only experience. Bakers tested readiness by tossing in flour to see if it burned, or by feeling the stone floor with wet hands. Bread as currency. Bread was more than sustenance. In medieval economies, it was a form of payment, a social indicator, and a religious offering. Landowners paid workers partly in loaves. Tenants received daily bread in exchange for field labor. Monasteries distributed alms, bread to the poor, dense loaves made from bran and coarse rye. Lords hosted bread feasts, offering white loaves as a sign of wealth and hospitality. In cities, bakers were regulated. Their loaves were weighed, and prices were set by law, especially in times of famine. The assize of bread and ale, a medieval English law dating back to the 13th century, set specific rules for the weight and price of bread depending on the price of wheat. Bakers who cheated were fined or, in some cases, put in the stocks. The phrase baker's dozen stems from this era. To avoid punishment, bakers often gave 13 loaves for every 12 purchased, hedging against underweight bread. The texture of the table. Bread came in many forms: regional, class-based, and tied to occasion. Manchet, a fine white wheat loaf for the nobility. Maslin, a blend of wheat and rye, eaten by the middling class. Horse bread, a coarse, multigrain loaf often fed to animals but eaten in lean times. Black bread, dense, dark, and sour, common among peasants. Loaves were often used as trencher plates, flat rounds of stale bread on which stews, meats, and sauces were served. These trenchers soaked up juices and were later eaten or given to the poor. Stale bread was not wasted. It was stewed, fried, crumbled into porridge, or fed to animals. Every crumb was accounted for. A bite of history. In the modern world, bread is often cheap, soft, and standardized. But in the medieval kitchen, it was a living thing, the product of weather, community, risk, and patience. No two loaves were ever quite the same. Each was a small act of survival and continuity. And yet across Europe, day after day, century after century, people gathered at tables large and small to break bread, to give thanks, and to share what they had. An unrisen question. So we wonder, in a world where bread was never guaranteed, how did its uncertainty shape the rituals of community and care? What lessons were kneaded into the hands of those who baked not by clock or cookbook, but by memory, feel, and faith? In the medieval world, water was not always safe. Wells could be contaminated, streams fouled by upstream tanners or waste pits. Boiling water took time and fuel, which were precious resources. So for most people, beer was the safer choice, a daily drink for children, monks, peasants, and lords alike. But this was not the bitter, hoppy brew of modern pubs. Medieval beer was cloudy, lightly alcoholic, and meant to be consumed quickly. It was made at home or in monasteries, and its primary role was nourishment, not intoxication. Small beer, as it was called, contained just enough alcohol to prevent spoilage, but not enough to impair judgment. It was liquid bread, a source of calories, minerals, and hydration all in one. The ingredients of the medieval brew. The core ingredients of beer were simple, but each brought its own variability. Grain, usually barley, though wheat, oats, and rye were also used. Grains were malted, soaked in water to sprout, then dried to stop growth, activating enzymes that converted starch into sugar. Water, drawn from wells, rivers, or rain barrels. Its mineral content and cleanliness shaped the flavor and safety of the brew. Yeast, not added directly, but rather collected from the air or left over from a previous batch, what brewers called goddessgood, a divine gift that caused fermentation. Flavorings. Before hops became common in the 15th century, brewers used a mixture called gruit, a blend of herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, sage, and juniper. These offered preservation and flavor, though with unpredictable effects. The result was a beverage that changed from village to village, season to season, batch to batch. The brewing process. Brewing was both kitchen chemistry and communal craft, typically done by women known as alewives in small batches for household use or local sale. The basic process involved mashing crushed malted grain was soaked in hot water in a large vat to extract sugars, forming a thick, sweet liquid known as wort. Boiling, the wort was boiled to kill bacteria and incorporate herbs or spices. Cooling and fermenting. The liquid was cooled in wide, shallow vessels, then left open to the air or pitched with yeast from a prior batch where it would begin to bubble within hours. Settling and drawing off. Once fermentation slowed, within 2-3 days, the beer was drawn into wooden barrels or ceramic jugs. It was ready to drink within a few days, though stronger versions could be kept longer. The alewife's world. For much of the medieval period, the brewing of beer was a female-dominated craft. Women brewed for their own households and sold excess beer to neighbors. In towns, some widows and single women became full-time alewives, supporting themselves through steady brewing and sales. These women hung out bushes or poles the ale stake to signal that fresh beer was available. Their names appear in tax records, legal rolls, and ecclesiastical complaints. Brewing gave them independence and economic power, but also exposure to public scrutiny. They faced frequent accusations of overcharging, watering down beer, selling sour or unclean batches. Some towns enforced inspections, and alewives could be fined or publicly shamed if found in violation. Still, alewives formed a critical part of the local economy. Without them, many households, particularly among laborers, would have gone thirsty. Beer and monastic innovation. While alewives brewed for homes and villages, monasteries elevated the process into a discipline. Monks had the tools, time, and literacy to refine techniques, record observations, and develop consistency. Many abbeys built large brew houses, some producing hundreds of gallons a week. They used larger fermenting vessels, conducted multiple mashes, and began experimenting with cooler fermentation techniques that yielded cleaner-tasting beer. Monastic beer was consumed by monks as part of daily life, particularly during fasts, when solid food was restricted. Rich in calories, it was sometimes called liquid bread, a term still used in German brewing culture today. Monks also served beer to travelers, pilgrims, and the poor. In some places, donating a portion of the brew to charity was part of religious obligation. Beer, hops, and a turning point. One of the most significant changes in beer history came with the introduction of hops, a flowering plant that added bitterness and had powerful preservative properties. Hopped beer could be kept longer, traveled better, and resisted souring. It allowed for larger-scale production and trade, especially in the Low Countries and Germany. But not everyone embraced hops at first. English and French brewers saw hopped beer often imported as unnatural, medicinal, or foreign. Laws were passed in some areas to restrict hop use. Ale and beer were sometimes labeled separately. Ale was unhopped and local, beer was hopped and continental. By the 16th century, however, hops gained acceptance, particularly as urban populations grew and demanded more stable drink. This shift marked the beginning of beer as a commercial enterprise rather than a domestic task. It also contributed to the decline of alewives, whose small batches couldn't compete with centralized, hopped production. A common cup. Whether made in a convent or a cottage, beer was drunk at every meal. Children drank watered-down small beer from wooden mugs. Workers took jugs of ale into the fields. Lords and ladies sipped it from pewter tankards, alongside roasted meats. Travelers bought it in inns. Beggars received it as alms. It was not considered sinful, nor particularly festive. It was part of daily sustenance, as natural as bread or porridge. And like bread, its making tied people to weather, soil, and community. The fermenting question. If beer and bread both came from grain and yeast, both products of life and decay, how did medieval people think about this transformation? Did they see it as science, or as something divine? And what have we lost in our rush toward uniformity, pasteurization, and plastic packaging, that they once held dear in the bubbling noise of fermentation and the scent of fresh ale at dawn? In a world without thermometers, timers, or gas knobs, cooking was a deeply tactile process. The medieval hearth was both kitchen and heat source, central to the home, but difficult to control. It was where water boiled, bread baked, soup simmered, meat roasted, and families huddled during cold months. Hearths varied. In small cottages, they were shallow pits or simple brick enclosures. In manorial kitchens or monasteries, massive fireplaces with iron cranes and multiple flues allowed for more sophisticated cooking. But even in the best conditions, fire was inconsistent. The temperature could change minute by minute, depending on wood quality, wind, or the angle of the chimney. Cooks judged readiness by color of coals, the feel of rising heat on skin, and the sizzling of fat in pans. It required practice, often a lifetime of it. There were no written recipes for beginners. Cooks learned by observation and oral tradition, passed down within families, abbeys, or servant ranks. Tools of the trade. The medieval cook worked with a modest but clever set of tools. Cauldrons and kettles, hung from hooks or rested on trivets, for boiling stews, porridges, or beer. Spits turned slowly over flames, often by hand, or in wealthier homes, by dog-powered treadmill wheels. Griddles or iron plates, laid directly over embers to bake flatbreads or fry meat. Pots of soapstone or earthenware, set at the edge of the fire for slow cooking. Oven baking for pies or pastries required access to a communal or private stone oven, which had to be preheated with firewood cleaned of ash, and then filled quickly with prepared dishes. Much of medieval cooking was layered and long-form grains simmering for hours, roots softening over half a day, meat slowly roasting or drying near smoke. Measuring without measuring. Measurements were instinctive, and terms were evocative rather than precise. A good handful. A knob of butter. Boil it until it be tender. Let it see the space of a paternoster, about 15 seconds, the time it takes to say the Lord's Prayer. Proportions were guided by habit, memory, and need. A dish might be adapted for more mouths, or altered based on what was available in the garden, the larder, or the forest that day. Rather than strict instructions, medieval recipes, when recorded, were often reminders for experienced cooks. A typical 14th century entry might say, "Take the flesh of capon and hew it small, and do it in a pot and boil it, and then add thereto almond milk, and season with sugar and serve forth." Nothing about how much, nothing about how long, the assumption you'd know. The flavor palette. Contrary to modern assumptions, medieval food was not bland. It was highly spiced, richly sauced, and heavily seasoned, particularly among the wealthy. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, saffron, and galangal were imported at great cost and displayed status. Even small households used mustard, vinegar, garlic, and herbs like sage, parsley, and dill. In Northern Europe, preserved items such as pickled herring, salted pork, dried peas, and cabbage were staples during winter. Fermentation, salting, and smoking were the only reliable ways to preserve perishables. Sour, sweet, spicy, and salty were often combined in a single dish. Think chicken in vinegar sugar sauce with raisins and pepper. While modern cooks chase balance, medieval cooks often celebrated contrast and intensity. Dining hierarchies. What was cooked depended greatly on who you were. Peasants boiled grains, pottage, black bread, root vegetables, and on rare occasions cheese or meat. Merchants, a wider range, salted fish, honey cakes, stews with legumes, and imported spices in moderation. Nobles, extravagant banquets featuring roast swan, gilded pastries, spiced wine, pies stuffed with multiple animals, and elaborate sugar sculptures. Feasting was as much performance as sustenance. Royal kitchens employed dozens of cooks, carvers, sauciers, and servers. Foods were dyed with saffron or parsley juice for color. Marchpane, early marzipan, was molded into castles or beasts. Spiced wine was served hot from engraved goblets. But even here, the knowledge behind the food remained intimate and practical. Cooks knew how long a capon took to roast, not from a chart but from smell, texture, and the look of juices at the bone. The kitchen as survival. For poorer households, the kitchen was not a place of creativity, it was a place of adaptation. Every part of an animal was used. Blood in puddings, bones in broth, fat rendered for candles. Cabbage cores were boiled with onions. Old bread thickened soup. Apple peels fermented into vinegar. Ashes from the hearth could be used for lye soap. And during lean times, families turned to acorns, nettles, or boiled grass, stretching what little they had. Food was rarely wasted, it was too hard won. A kitchen without recipes. The modern idea of the cookbook as a precise manual did not fully emerge until the 17th and 18th centuries. Before that, kitchen knowledge was embodied, communal, and intuitive. Cooks trained under older relatives or as servants in large houses. Skill was gained through repetition and shared memory. The kitchen was filled with unwritten wisdom. How to gauge flour quality by its scent. How to test water heat by dipping in a finger or observing a shimmer. How to mend a curdled sauce with vinegar and flour. When to skim a broth. When to trust silence. In this way, food became not only nourishment but a living thread passed between generations, across gender and class, across famine and feast. A taste forgotten. We often say today that cooking is easier than ever, and it is thermometers beep, ovens regulate, and ingredients can be summoned by app. But in this ease, what did we leave behind? When people once cooked by feel, sight, smell, and instinct, were they not more deeply attuned to the rhythms of their environment, their bodies, their land? Could we find something again, not in perfect replication, but in slowing down, in noticing the heat of a pan, the color of coals, the scent of flour, the quiet of waiting?